The Week in Bible Prophecy, a Prophecy Watchers podcast.
Welcome to the program today. My name is Mondo Gonzalez here in studio, and I have through Skype our good friend Graham all the way from England, and we are going to be continuing a series that we began not too long ago on the Israel dilemma. And to me, it's a fascinating discussion because as we look around, again, even in the church world, there is a lot of confusion as it relates to how we approach Israel. The Bible, 5/6 of the Bible is about Israel, and so it requires a little bit of effort on our part. Before we get to Graham, I want to remind everybody about our upcoming conference in Orlando, Florida, March 27th through 30th. It's going to be a great time. Always love actually being in Orlando in the spring, in late spring, getting out of Oklahoma's a little bit chilly weather. So you can join us, prophecywatchers.com, check it out, get all the details there, see the 18 speakers that we have going on. Again, the 2025, it seems like we're saying this all the time, the next year is very, very important. It's going to be integral, but that is no surprise as we see the end of the age approaching. We would not be surprised to see the way things are coming together as it relates to prophetic trends. So Graham, welcome.
Hello, Mondo. Good to join you again.
Yes, and here we are with, when we think about the dilemma of modern Israel, I'm reminded of Zechariah chapter 12, where God specifically says that Jerusalem, and certainly by extension, Israel, is going to be a burdensome stone, a cup of trembling that is going to cause, a challenge, a dilemma, for lack of a better word, for the nations of the world. And here we are, ever since Israel became a nation, and even before that, in 1948, as we know, which we'll discuss today. Right at the beginning, why do you think Israel, here at the end of the age, 1947 and prior, why do you think? What's your theological background to why has it caused such trouble amongst the nations of the world?
So you always throw a hard question at me. Let me see. I think because, Mondo, in one sense, it's, you're talking about the heavy stone, the burdensome stone, right? I know in another series that we did, we kind of talked about that. I tend to think that Jesus himself is the burdensome stone. That that it's his kingship in Jerusalem, which the nations now. And let's not forget here, because we got the Jews and the Gentiles, and it's burdensome for all of them. Mm-hmm. Right? We just tend to think it's burdensome for the Gentiles, for all the nations, but it's actually very burdensome for the Jews as well, present day Jews, because they're still in their blindness. They don't want their king, or they're not looking for the same king that we're looking for. So in that blindness, then they're also stumbling around trying to fix this problem, which is completely unfixable. And I think it's because Israel is the redemption for the nations, and Jesus is the redemption of Israel, and then thereby extension the redemption of the nations. And of course, if the world does not want his redemption, and even the Jews themselves currently do not want his redemption, then what else is it going to be other than a very burdensome stone which they're trying to shift? They're trying to, it comes to mind, those, like the pyramids there in Egypt, in Giza, those big pyramids, those massive stones, trying to haul those things across the desert, haul them up the steps. And you imagine trying to get that capstone on top of that big pyramid. And I just think that's why it's so burdensome, because it's not just a political issue, it's not just a land issue, it's a redemption issue. And, what God has decided to do is what he will, the work that he has begun, he will complete, as Paul says.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because you see in Matthew 22, which is a quote from the Psalms, where Jesus talks about, have you never read, about the chief, the stone that the builders rejected became the chief stone at the corner. And Jesus says, all those who come against it are going to be, broken, but those whom it goes against are going to be crushed. And so I do find that fascinating that ultimately, Israel, as we know, is primarily a secular country, and its own challenge, its own solution for its own salvation is never going to be met because they refuse the cornerstone of Jesus himself. And so when we think about this, and I think what you said there was good, in the nations of the world, the dilemma of Israel, can it be fixed in this life apart from the reestablishment of Jesus as the Messiah for Israel first and then for the rest of the nations? Is it even possible?
No. I think it's meant to be that way.
Yes.
It's meant to be that there is no other plan. So, as we'll discuss this further, but, we were talking beforehand about how Israel is the West dilemma. So, people sort of like want to say, well, why does the West keep banging the drum about the two-state solution and et cetera, et cetera? Well, they're doing it for very practical reasons and very moral reasons in their own in their own thought processes, because the nations are not looking for the return of the king. Okay, so Israel again. Israel has set itself up as we have this phrase, Mondo, about Israel as a colonial settler state, etc. Partly true, that is, but it's modeled itself. The modern state of Israel has modeled itself to be a modern a Western liberal democratic state, and that is nowhere found in Israel's destiny in the scriptures, right? So it's so it still wants to be like all the other nations, but particularly like the Western nations, because we're the most progressive in that sense of the term, the most successful civilization ever to be founded upon the earth, for sure. Technology, science, but we know where democracy is taking the West. We know that what's happening with the West is that when it is abandoning the very pillars which uphold that democracy, the West is in decay. It's been in moral decay since the 60s, and it's because it will move further into decay. So all of this thing has to come to an end, right? The West has to come to an end. The East has to come to an end. It all has to come to an end. So we shouldn't sort of be bemoaning that end. That we should have our eyes open to how is this end coming about, and what should we be. So here's what we need to think about. I think, Mondo, is that how the nations think about Israel, whether for or against, is one thing. How Israel thinks about itself, how the Jews think about Israel, is another thing. But as Christians, as those who we declare ourselves to have received, be in the light, as it were, because what's interesting, I suppose, and maybe this is why we're doing this series, is that yes, Israel is a burdensome stone for the Jews, and it's a burdensome stone for the Gentiles. Jerusalem, I mean, but it's also a burdensome stone for the church, and really it shouldn't be that way. We really should have a bit of a clear understanding and be able to take our moral judgments, that we're not looking at this in blindness, but that we're looking at this through the light of the gospel and the plan of redemption for the nations. I think that's what we're just trying to invite that conversation. Yeah,
I think that the fascinating thing is, God has spoken clearly in the New Testament. And of course, we know the greatest exposition of the understanding of the role of Israel from the transition from Old Testament theocratic Israel into the New Testament, where God has postponed or put on hold the theocratic Israel, and now the Jews that get saved are part of the church. But the greatest exposition is Romans 9 through 11. And of course, then we understand a little bit more in the book of Hebrews, which is, again, is the book of the Jews, if you wanted to say it that way. But I think that's often the case that is most ignored It's too easy for many in the church historically, going back to Augustine and others that have more of an allegorical approach, that just say, oh, all the promises of the Israel or the theocratic nation of Israel in the Old Testament, if there wasn't a literal fulfillment that we can see, then we'll just transfer all of them over to the church. And so when you have that as a backdrop, and you come to the New Testament and it says Israel, most people just will say, oh, well, Israel means the church. It never does, not even once, ever, a single time. Even Galatians 6:16 doesn't say that. But they try to take one potential idea in Galatians 6 and then force it on every other passage, which doesn't work. But if we come to understand Romans 9 through 11, very clearly, as you said, we will have the best articulation of understanding how to deal and how to nuance our way through this dilemma that we have today.
Yes, yeah, because obviously people hold their views with great convictions. So I don't belittle people's great convictions. If people actually, if this is the way they feel, I had to. I've lived my life by my convictions, but I don't impose those on somebody else. So, when it comes to war, do you support war? Do you pick up arms to sort of participate in a war? So people have their convictions, and people see the bloodshed which is going on in that area. Whether you want to call it Palestine, whether you want to call it Israel, but in that whole area, and it's heartbreaking. You know what I mean? With children and innocent children being slaughtered, being killed, should I say? Who wants that? When our Savior says, "Suffer the children to come unto me," it's just like and I think that's where we have to really navigate this and say, okay, Lord, how should I be thinking about this whole, because this whole scenario, because what we don't want to do is, so there's the one side of the ditch, as you rightly pointed out, Mondo, which was the anti-Semitism, the church has replaced Israel, all the promises to Israel now go to the church, etc. But what we don't want to do is, those of us who reject that, is to swing to the other side on the pendulum and the other side of the ditch and be completely oblivious to, well, hang on, the modern state of Israel cannot continue in its present form, and it's not meant to, and the Jews are currently still in their blindness, and their leaders are still in the blindness. They are still sheep without a shepherd, because their great shepherd has left. He's gone to heaven. But he's orchestrated events in order to bring them to a place where they will eventually acknowledge the true shepherd. And and I really do feel, especially the young people there, because you hear different. I watch different videos, and you hear the Zionist dream dying. Also in a younger generation. Is this what Zionism is? If it is, I want nothing to do with it. And they're deeply convicted about it. So this is not about them being self-hating Jews. They're deeply convicted about it. And so, and when I look at the young people, especially, if they're in the IDF, they had to go, they fight for the nation, and then some of these soldiers who have come out of the IDF and have said, the things they've had to do or the things they witnessed, and they've renounced it all. So this is not about, any war is a terrible business, right? So I come from a nation which has fought many wars. It's the same with you, Mondo. Because you're the victor in a war doesn't mean that you've engaged the war properly. It doesn't mean you've engaged the war morally. You could have done, your nation could have done some terrible things in the execution of a war. And that's what I love about when it says about Jesus in Revelation. It says he makes war in righteousness. So he's right, the only one who can really do that, make war in righteousness. I mean, we can have a righteous cause, but for a lot of times when men make war, as you get older, you kind of like think about these things. Vengeance very easily takes over. You did this to me, we're doing this to you, etc., etc. So, and I think what we are trying to do here is trying to see through the story, because Jesus speaks about the birth pangs, right? But boy, as this nation, as this regathering of the Jews to the land of their forefathers, has this not been birth pang after birth pang after birth pang? And we'll get into some of these again, some of the history of this, just to see how gruesome it's been.
Yeah, I think it's helpful in evaluating, again, just the overall understanding of the theology of Israel, and what that looks like today. It hasn't taken, it took a back seat, really, in many ways, I would say, for most of the church history ever since, I would say, 135 AD with the Bar Kokhba revolt. It hasn't been, Israel was kind of just, again, exiled into the nations of the world, and there was always Jews in different parts, and they had their ups and downs, no doubt, and certainly a lot of unfair and horrible persecution where they went. But the other challenge that you have is that now that God has gathered some, not all, has gathered them back into the land. He says, in Ezekiel 38, the mountains that were laid waste or were wasted for a long time, after a long period of time. Now Jews are back in the mountains of Israel again. And so it forces the discussion now. You could have avoided it 200 years ago. But now here you have this group that God has brought back through miraculous means in the 20th century. And it not only do you have the Jews have to deal with it, as you just mentioned, but the nations now are being forced to have to deal with this little country that is condemned in the United Nations more than anybody else ever. More than China, all the human rights, you name it. All the treatment of women and all the Islamic countries, those don't get, condemned. But here you have this democratic nation that's trying to live like the world, apart from God. You have a few, 20%, 25% religious there. That they don't necessarily like the secular country, the leaders anyway. But at the end of the day, the world now is focused, and so we're titling this the rogue state, because that really is the perception of much of the world, is it not?
It is, yes. It's amazing how many nations do not recognize the state of Israel. But of course, you spoke about the UN. The constant condemnation of Israel in the UN. Of course, there are now 195 nations in the UN. It was not always thus, because the UN approved the partition plan and passed it with let me just get it was 33. Let me just get the numbers. It is here somewhere, Mondo. They passed it. The majority, I think they had about 10 abstentions. And I think it was passed about 38. We'll come to these numbers, but but it was passed. It was recognised by the UN. Majority nations did, but then but immediately, of course, the Arabs actually didn't just go to war against the new fledgling state of Israel, because Ben Gurion declared the state. Was 15th of May 48, wasn't it? They actually went to war against the United Nations. The will of the United Nations. Now, of course, we've seen the United Nations morph beyond all recognition to what it is now. But we mentioned this previously. The UN was actually was a bit of an Anglo-American creation. And then it started, obviously, it was St. James's Palace here, with Churchill getting those nations fighting against Nazi tyranny. And then, of course, with Roosevelt and the Atlantic Charter, Roosevelt and Churchill, there just off the coast of America. So they met, and that was fed in then to this into the sort of the framework of this new institution. Because basically what they decided that, listen, the League of Nations has collapsed. That didn't work. We just can't keep going to war with each other. There has to be a place where we can all sit around and talk and work out our differences. So again, the best intentions in the world in terms of trying to, we do not want another world war. So, you know, let's do this. And then, of course, it was Roosevelt, I think, who came up with the actual name, the United Nations. And Churchill said, no, I like that. So that's where it was adopted. But, you know, back in those days, of course, when you had like 58 nations or 53 nations, that's something like around about that, it was predominantly a Western-driven organization, right? But of course now, you know, your country, my country too, certainly Israel, are kind of lone voices really at the UN. Where now it's and I read also just before we did this, there are now 120. I don't know if you knew this, but there are 121 countries in a non-aligned movement that didn't align with either of the superpowers, and they are the biggest. They are the biggest grouping in the United Nations. But again, a lot of those don't recognize the state of Israel. So even though the UN recognized it, but the thing about the UN is that once a nation is recognized, it cannot be dissolved. So the only way the state of Israel itself, and I think this is where, you know, eschatologically, is it going to come to this? I think it probably will. The only way that the United Nations can unrecognize the state of Israel is if the United Nations itself is dissolved, right? So this is why it's in a bind. This is why they pass all these resolutions and they get themselves further into a bind. And of course, then you have the veto powers of the 5 permanent members, and so, you know, and Israel is like the football in the United Nations. But like you say, yeah, nobody ever condemns Iran, or nobody ever condemns, you know, any of the humanitarian. I mean, look what's happening again now in Syria, right?
Yeah.
That's flared up again, you know. Assad is what he killed 300,000 of his own people. You see nobody walking the streets.
No protests. Yep.
No protest, free Syria, free Syria. It's only ever free Palestine. So you have to ask the question, why? Why is this such a small country? Why does it have such a stranglehold on the world's conscience? Because it gone.
I think that is the exact question which even the most ardent skeptic, or even somebody that doesn't necessarily believe the Bible, to me, people have to take a look and go, yeah, why is that? And for us, with the biblical lens, we know the answer because it's a spiritual issue.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a spiritual issue where the enemy of humanity certainly is Satan, but even more so, the enemy of Israel is Satan, no doubt. Because why? He knows Israel has a future, and that's why we see in Revelation chapter 12, ultimately, the son of Satan, the Antichrist figure, if we want to talk about that, goes to genocide. His goal, we see that clearly. He goes to make war and to dissolve and to get rid of the woman there. So whatever that, but nevertheless, you see the persecution against the people of Israel, which is no surprise. And so when you look at the anti-Semitism around the world, and you think about the thinking of the world, right? We're not to be conformed to this world, right? We're to be transformed. So you see that in Romans 12, you see it in 1 John, that the world speaks to itself and the world listens to itself. But who's the ruler of the world? Well, Jesus told us who that is in the Gospel of John. We see that the whole world lies under the power of the wicked one in 1 John 5, 19. So to me, when you see all these scriptures come together, it's not surprising then that the world would speak in unison against the people of Israel, which just reveals, again, it's a spiritual issue.
Yeah, and ultimately, I mean, when this movement began, we discussed this previously, began in the it began here, really, the Restorationist movement. And the thinking behind the Restorationist movement was the Jews returning to the land of their forefathers to facilitate the second coming of Jesus, right? Well, that narrative really dies at the end of the 18s, at the end of the 1900s, right? The end of the 1800s. That sort of dies. There's a few people who are holding on to it, but for the most part, it's not about fulfilling prophecy now. Now it becomes more of a geopolitical thing. But of course, there is still it still has its great champions. Like Winston Churchill is a great champion of the Jews returning. And of course, we discussed that last time, that he was booted out of office, and he had hoped for this Anglo-American partnership to be able to establish this homeland in Palestine, as it then was, for the Jews, bringing them to statehood, etc. But the Anglo-American thing didn't really take off. So we're getting to then into the I don't know if we want to do this now, but into like the second part. We talk about these birth pangs. The second part of the story, again, Mono, just to see that how this thing is edged forward, just step upon step, and then a back step and a forward step, but it's just been so painful for the entire region. And it's a problem the world cannot fix unless you either do it by getting rid of Israel completely, the state of Israel, of course, which the West will not do because the West is Israel's sponsor, or opt for some sort of two-state solution, which is also unworkable, or for a single state. We'll talk about these things, whether it's a single a greater Israel state, so a one-state solution, that was not going to work, or whether it's a one-state Palestinian state, that's not going to work either. So it's just like none of this stuff is going to work. But you'll notice I've changed the flags here for this episode, because I feel we need to give another partner of this Israel story. I tried to find one where I could put all four flags together, the British flag, the Israeli flag, the Stars and Stripes, and then the tricolour, the French tricolour, but it wouldn't do it. So I've had to sacrifice the Stars and Stripes. Sorry, everyone. It's like just for this episode, because what's really interesting is that that here's something that I don't know if you. It's something that said that. President Harry Truman, I just thought there was it's just something that he said. So Truman actually, so the first country to recognize the state of Israel is the USSR, right? It's Joseph Stalin. Truman comes along very quickly after that and recognize it. But I just noticed here something. As an American, you might want to speak into this. So here's Harry Truman. And he says, and of course he gets this accolade of being Cyrus, and he does a great work. He brings really the free world along with recognizing the state of Israel. And he says here, the Jews, I find, are very, very selfish. They care not how many Estonians, Latvians, Finns, Poles, Yugoslavs, or Greeks get murdered or mistreated as displaced persons, as long as the Jews get special treatment. Yet when they have power, physical, financial, or political, neither Hitler nor Stalin has anything on them for cruelty or mistreatment to the underdog. I thought that is a pretty that's a pretty wild statement, right? That's almost, I don't know, I don't think he was anti-Semitic. It's almost bordering on that kind of language, isn't it? I mean, to say that they're worse than Hitler or Stalin, but either way, he's very frustrated with the Zionists, the Zionists themselves. But what people may not be aware of is that Israel's closest ally, because America enforces an arms embargo on the region. It will not participate in this war of independence. The British already have arms treaties with the Arab nations, so they've already supplied them. And Israel gets its weapons from the USSR, effectively from Czechoslovakia, to fight the war, that what's called the First Arab-Israeli War, the War of Independence. Again, which is like the although the UN had declared the partition, it had no way to enforce it, except, is everybody going to agree with this and know that? But then the British found that out either. The Arabs were not just going to agree with it. And we'll get into why that is the case, whether that it's a legitimate. In one sense, it's legitimate, and then in another sense, perhaps it's illegitimate. But we'll get into that. But anyway, the closest ally that Israel has over the next 20 years is France. So the whole idea about, is Israel a nuclear power? She won't say whether she is or whether she isn't, ambiguity, what have you. Well, if it is, and I think we all think it is, it gets its nuclear technology from France, not from America or from Britain, because France has its own nuclear program, its independent nuclear program. So and then there's a second war. We can't go into too much detail, but we just kind of like want to go through the four major wars that Israel has, where they gain territory, and then they cede it again, and then they gain it back, and then they give it back again, all in this desire to find this place of peace in the Middle East, of acceptance by all the nations, that or the surrounding nations. And of course, much to Churchill's, we won't go back into him, but much to Churchill's disappointment, because he got kicked out, he said, I can't do anything more about this. But he's actually elected back off at Downing Street in 1951. He only stays there a couple of years. 1953, he hands over to his foreign secretary called Anthony Eden. He's his foreign secretary. Anthony Eden then becomes prime minister. And then we have this scenario. It's called now the Second Arab-Israeli War. Here it's known as the Suez Crisis. It's 1956. And basically, the story behind that is General Abdel Nasser of Egypt. That he's the first pan-Arab leader. He sees himself as this, maybe have his own like caliphate, what have you. I don't know what they call it in the Egyptian Islamic world, but he sees himself as a pan-Arab leader. Of course, France had built the Suez Canal. Britain had kind of financed it and had administered it as well. But Nasser wants to nationalize the Suez Canal, and then he's also forbidding Israeli shipping to come through the canal, what have you. So with this on the pretext or the pretense, somebody would say, of freeing the canal, Britain, France, and Israel concoct a plan to invade Egypt and to retake the canal. And then, so Israel is going to come down through the Sinai Peninsula, take over the Sinai Peninsula, which it does with relative ease. Britain and France effectively paratroop themselves into Egypt and take over the place with little force. But the two great powers at that particular time, the two superpowers, in fact, this is what historians say is what really seals Britain's fate as a superpower in the region, because it never then sort of seeks to impose itself upon that region again independently. It's a humiliation for Britain, but it actually comes about from the humiliation. Britain is caught between a pincer movement between the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Of course, they're now in this Cold War. They're leading the Cold War. The Russians, the Soviets are making noises. The Americans are saying, well, and literally the Russians, the Soviets tell the Americans, you call up Britain or France, or otherwise this is going into a wider conflict, because you had circles of influence. And of course at that time Israel was, as I understand it, was a non-aligned nation, because it had received its support from the Soviets right at the beginning of its independence, and of course, and America was ambivalent or ambiguous towards Israel for the next 20 years. There was an arms embargo still in place. Israel, because America's doing its kind of its hegemonic, um, in terms of, you know, the Western influence. It's holding off the Soviet influence or what have you. And of course, the Middle East is the battleground for influence both for East and West. Mm-hmm. So literally, America, Eisenhower tells Eden. He says, if you don't withdraw, I'm going to sink the British economy. I'll sink the pound. I will, you know, I'll sell all the government debt, what have you. So Britain had no option other, because we were still on we'd come out of rations only 2 years. We were still on rations 54, so we're heavily reliant on American support. So Britain obviously had to turn tail, and it was a national humiliation. Again, that is where that's where Britain really ceases its role in the Middle East. And in 57, of course, so it's the story of Israel getting the Sinai, and then they hand it back in 57. They hand it back to Egypt, right? And then this sort of like, you know, this sort of like goes on then all into the 60s. You then have where the PLO really forms in 1964, I believe it is, under Yasser Arafat, as something of a national identity. Now, of course, Palestinians today will dispute that, discount that, say no, we always had a national identity, right? Mm-hmm. It's just, but this is how people are viewing history. And then you get to like the third Arab-Israeli war, and so it's called the 6-Day War, and then that again is Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. And again, it's the British Franco alliance with Israel, because Israel actually fights this war. America's now just begun to sort of drip weapons into Israel. So Israel actually fights that war with British and French weapons, armaments. So again, you have the 6-Day War. We all know what happens there. Israel gains the West Bank and the Sinai again, Gaza and the Golan Heights, right? And what's really interesting about that 6-Day War is that so the Jordanians had the West Bank from 47 all the way to 67, right, for 20 years. And it didn't cross their mind to create a Palestinian state, because their ambition was to annex that, and then hopefully in the 6-Day War was to get more territory from Israel, so to expand the Jordanian state. But why did the Jordanians not consider creating a Palestinian state there in the West Bank? Your thoughts, Mondo?
Well, what you do see them doing is creating a Jordanian citizenship for all of them, you know, basically from 48 to 67 after the first war, you know, the War of Independence. And so they had, again, this is kind of the myth that you have, is that you had this separate identity of the Jordanians versus the Palestinians. That's simply not the case by any stretch at all. They were originally Jordanians, and it wasn't until later that the Jordanians washed their hands of it, stripped them all of Jordanian citizenship, and then left them, really their own people, kind of in limbo, but officially distancing themselves from it. So fact and myth are often inconvenient.
And this is what we kind of like trying to pick through, isn't it? You know, the myth of a mythic history, as it were. But it's the Jordanians. So for 20 years could have created, if they had created a Palestinian state in the West Bank when they had it, it would exist today.
I agree. Yep.
It would absolutely, because what happens is Golda Meir, isn't it? She's kind of, as I've read up on this, she's sent on the 6-Day War. She's sent to Jordan to say, do not fire a shot. Do not,
stay out. Stay out.
This is like Egypt and Syria, mainly who are driving from the south and driving from the north. And Jordan was invited or told, stay out, do not enter the war. And if they had stayed out, they would still have the West Bank.
They would.
Because Israel simply wasn't going to, on three fronts, was not going to fight that war on three fronts. The Palestinians, of course, still wouldn't have a state. And that's why the Palestinians feel that they've been sold out by Jordan as well. They look at Jordan as...
Well, let me just say this. In fact, the Palestinians would have had a state. It would have been the state of Jordan.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. But not an independent
Correct.
Palestinian state on the west bank of the Jordan and on the Jordan River. So the Jordanians thought, well, here's an opportunity now. The Israelis are going to lose this war. We can get more territory there on the West Bank and extend our the Egyptians will take some of it. The Syrians will take some of it, and it's 1947 all over again. And it's like they haven't really learned the lesson there. And so, what happens is the Jordanians do not stay out of the war, and they lose the entire territory and they lose East Jerusalem. Yeah. So again, we mentioned, or you mentioned this before, about in one sense it's a defensive war for Israel, but they went on the offensive, and of course the Jordan then lost the territory, and of course this now creates the problem, because what does now the United Nations do with this? And so they create this the UN Resolution 242, which is still kind of causing problems today. But again, that's kind of like it's another document which is full of ambiguity. It's a bit like the Balfour Declaration. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like it's promising two things, and neither can be delivered. But what's really interesting is that the Israelis, the Egyptians, the Syrians, and I think even the Jordanians all agree to the UN Resolution 242. We'll read what the resolution is now, but they agree to it. But the Palestinians actually believe that this is an Anglo-American Israeli stitch-up. Mm-hmm. Because it was actually a resolution sponsored by Britain, because they were trying to, and then, obviously with the backing of the United States, and then, and 50 nations on the Security Council voted unanimously for this resolution. So what's really interesting about this resolution, if I can find it, it is on my system here somewhere. So the resolution 242. 22nd November 67, it's land for peace, that Israel would withdraw from territories it occupied in the war in exchange for peace with the Arab world. Respect for sovereignty. All states in the area would respect each other's sovereignty, territorial integrity and political independence. Right to live in peace. Israel would have the right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries. End territorial claims. All parties would end territorial claims. And termination of belligerency, states of belligerency would be terminated. But there's a problem here immediately, because it's recognized between states. Mm-hmm. So what is Israel going to do? Well, return it to Jordan, because Jordan kind of illegally owned that for 20 years. Okay. But that's the state which is responsible for it. There is no Palestinian state. Mm-hmm. So, of course, this idea then that, well, this is territory going to be given to a Palestinian state, that has kind of found its way into this resolution. But really, when you're looking at this, it's just a case of the ceasing of hostilities between states. There is no Palestinian state. What the world understands now is the West Bank, let's call it the West Bank because that's what they term it as, has been under military occupation now for all of these years. But who are Israel going to hand it back to? And what's really interesting is that in 1967, with the three no's of the Arab League at Khartoum, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations, and no peace with Israel. Mm-hmm. So, this resolution is dead in the water anyway. How are you actually going to progress this? Interesting, 1971, the PLO tries to overthrow the Jordanian monarchy, and Jordan expels the PLO, and then they move to Jordan, right? Because they want to destabilize. And of course, Lebanon, then we have the peace agreements, Egypt, Camp David in 1978. And again, it's this idea of Israel gets the Sinai again, gives it back to Egypt for a peace agreement. But in 1988, Jordan relinquishes all rights to the West Bank. And then in 1994, the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel happens, and then the Oslo Accords, and then this West Bank is divided into zones of influence and who's controlling what. So it's an almighty mess, effectively, and sort of still is. I don't know if you want to finish, close off with what we're going, Do you want to close off with anything?
Yeah, just I think we've only scratched the surface of the depth of the complications that exist between all of the groups, and again, there's legal inconsistencies with the United Nations. There's historical inconsistencies. There's land grabs by these countries that have been created, after World War I, and so this is you couldn't create a what do they call it? Some kind of knot, whatever the phrase is. You couldn't create a more complex, unsolvable situation than what we have here. And I think, as we were discussing, this really is part of God's design. I really think in His sovereignty, this is part of the design, that the only way it's truly ever going to be solved, not even to human satisfaction, honestly, because the humans will still have their disagreements, and of course they're not going to like what God does. But this goes back to Psalm 2. God says, I will set my king on my holy hill of Zion, and he'll rule from there. End of story. And so, they plot a vain thing. They're raging against him, Psalm 2, but God laughs because He's like, this is my plan. You're not going to stop it. Yeah,
absolutely. And, and all the way from, you talk about the nations that were created in 1917, with the French, British carve up of the region. I mean, in God's plan too, thank goodness. Could you imagine if there was one just giant Arab state, in existence now, that Israel wouldn't exist?
No.
So these Arab states, have been at each other's throats.
Yes. And
in that, it has allowed Israel and the Jews to return. So all of this is in God's plan, and it's like you say, the vain imaginations of nations. Because ultimately God wants to bring this down to the return of the Jewish Messiah to the land of Israel. End of story. I like how you said that.
Yeah, end of story. Well, Graham, I appreciate you coming today. Everybody else, as you're watching, appreciate you guys being here. Stick around. We have a lot of further episodes to discuss, again, this whole dilemma all the way up until the Lord's return and what it looks like. And also, the pros and cons. I mean, there's humanism. There's a human element here in the sense of, we're waiting for Jesus to return, but that's not happened yet. So in the meantime, how do we navigate the waters of trying to understand theologically who does the land belong to? Does Israel deserve to be in the land? I mean, these are some of the things that I've been discussing lately in my travels around, around the world, and talking about, again, the theology of Israel. It's in the New Testament. Certainly, it's in most of the Bible. We need to have some understanding of this. Any final thoughts, Graham?
No, I mean, yeah, we'll try and deal with some of the solutions that are being proposed on the next one. We've dealt with the history, and I think we need to deal with the history, Mondo, just to say, this is a right old mess, and everybody has their story, everybody has their claims, everybody, and maybe legitimate too, but in the end. As Christians, I think we have to see the end of this, Mondo, is not democracy in the Middle East like the West wants to see, or even the Jews want to see. It's not an Islamic state, a theocratic state. It's as the Bible presents, and as we have to hold to. It's a theocratic state a theocratic kingdom. It's not even a state, a theocratic kingdom in the land of Israel. With the throne of David and the son of David seated on that throne.
Amen. Amen and amen. Thank you for watching, everybody, today. Make sure to stick around and stick around the channel. Catch us next time. It's always good. We'll see you then.